Now that we have the carcass removed, we need to go into the finished fleshing procedures. The first procedure is to remove the excess bones at all the fin roots, the excess cleithrium bones, the throat latch meat, the brain cavity, and the caudal fin extra tail bone we do not need. To do that, I like to put a little bit of borax right in the center to sop up some of this blood. Give my hand something to hold on to. If anytime you're slipping around here, you can put some of that on there. It really makes the job easier. I'm going to start with the anal fin bone. In order to remove the bone and the meat you see here, I need to take my fish skinning knife and just cut along that meat a little bit. Not too deep, just to the point where you can't really cut anymore. If it gets to the point where you have to start forcing it, you're cutting too far. I do that on both sides. And I'm not going in very deep at all, just enough to open it up, as you can see there. Because I open it up, now I can easily cut it out. There's a little ball bones that are all the way along. Each of these rays has a little bone and muscle that control it. So we're going to cut right underneath that little ball of bone. You can see how we did that. And that's all you need to take off. You wouldn't need to go any further than that. You could take this next level, but it's just not necessary. If we would have kept all this on there, this would have shrank in and looked unnatural and would have attracted bugs and not dried out properly. So it's very important that this is removed. We rebuilt this on our foam form by carving that little bit into it right there. That's what that is. Okay, now we're going to move up to the pelvic fins. These are the paired fins. You can see those here. These fins are paired together. So we're going to start by splitting them. I'm going to take my shears, go right in the center, cut down to the skin. You do not cut through the skin. Now you can see that they've both been separated. Now I can easily cut them. Sometimes you can grab onto them and just pull them up a little bit. Make sure I get right down to the bone, right against the skin. If you cut too far, you'll actually loosen these up enough so they fall out. If that happens, it's okay. Just mount them separately. We can put them on during the finishing process. Same on this bone. And those are ready for flushing. I need to get rid of this part of the cleithrium bone that's still stuck here. Just going to cut in, get rid of that. Now we're going to work on the throat latch. This is a very tricky part. It's one of the trickiest parts of skinning any fish. It's very delicate. If you're not careful, you will break this area out. It's not going to affect the quality of the amount at all, but it will make your job harder. It can be easily repaired, but it's not as good if we can keep it completely intact. So first thing I need to do is go in and start removing the meat. Right against the skin, I'm just kind of cutting through and in. I'm loosening this up. I'm not going to cut at this time all the way back to the end of the throat latch. I'm just cut right to where my finger is. The end of the throat latch is here. I cut to right here. I'm actually going to pull that the rest of the way out, but I have to free it up here first. What this is the pectoral fin bone. I'm just going to split that. I'm going to cut part of the cleithrium from the show side. I just split that bone down. As you can see, there's nothing there now, and that's where I am on the show side. So we didn't cut through the skin when we split the cleithrium. We split it from the back side of the fish. So we did not go through the skin towards the show side. That way you won't see it after the fish is dried. Now that we have all of this meat freed up from this way, I'm just going to take my cutter and just nip a little bit in here to loosen it up. Now you can see what I'm doing. I'm just working this back. The reason I didn't cut in here is because I would easily cut through this thin skin. Cutting it right to the throat latch. We're just going to make one cut across. You can see what that throat latch looked like. And that actually was right in there. You can actually see how thin that is. And that's why we keep it fairly thin on our form. So that's done at that point. We'll just come through with our flushing spoon for the rest of that. Now we have to remove the extra meat from around the cleithrium bone and the pectoral fin. Where we're going to be working is right through this area, but on the underside of the skin. What I like to do is put my finger underneath it, right up at the pectoral fin. That kind of pushes it out. So you can see what we're doing. We're going to cut in towards the pectoral fin. We're cutting the fin right here. Now our cutter is at the cleithrium bone. I'm just going to start splitting that down. I do not want to cut through. You will put a couple of small holes right through this thin membrane. And that's fine, it doesn't hurt anything. Now we're on the top of the cleithrium bone right here. I'm just cutting along that. I'm going to keep that intact for right now. We might split that a little bit more, but we're pretty good. But just how that looks there. Okay, this is the top part of the cleithrium bone from the back side or wall side of the fish. We're going to just get rid of that. That's not needed to be part of the mount, and it just has meat in it. It's completely unnecessary, so we get rid of it. Now we need to remove the fin roots from the spiny and the soft dorsal, which if you look on the show side, here's the spiny, here's the soft. We are working right along them here. So I'm going to cut along these just like I did on the anal fin, right along the edge, just to separate that meat so I can get at it with my cutter to get rid of that extra bone material. I cut on both sides just to open it up. You can see how I did that right there. Take my shears and I'm going to just cut right along. When you start out here, it's real easy to cut too far in. If you do, it's okay, but you want to try not to. See how I'm holding it parallel as I'm cutting. That's very important. If I was cutting like this, I'm going to be continuously cutting through the skin. So I'm just taking my hands underneath here, my fingers, and pushing this up so my cutter can easily find it and get rid of it. You want to get as close as you can without jeopardizing losing the fin or the integrity of the fin. What I mean by integrity of the fin is you don't want it to become very floppy. But you want to get as much meat out as you can. It makes for a much higher quality mount. So I'm going to continue that process right along the spiny dorsal. Again, this can be a little tricky right here. If you cut in too much, you might start losing some spikes from your spiny dorsal. If you do, it can be fixed. Now that that's removed, we're going to remove the brain cavity. It's very important that you remove all of the brain cavity. If you leave any of it in there, the mount is going to smell during the drying process, and some of that smoke could carry over into the finished mount, and it will attract bugs. We're going to use a triangle cutting pattern. We're going to be cutting in like this, right along the top of the esophagus, and directly against the show side skin up to the top here. So it's a triangle like this to loosen that area up. We want to get the vertebrae out and the brain cavity that goes right up into here. This is where it's going to be stopping your cut. On the initial cut, we're not going to try to get every little piece of it. We just want to open it up enough so we can finish it. I like to start out cutting right along the esophagus. You want to be careful you don't angle down and cut into the esophagus. So I like to have my cutter angled towards this vertebrae. You can actually hear me scratching on the vertebrae. If I was angled the other way, I would be cutting through that very thin esophagus skin, which is the top of the throat as you move back. To give you an idea of where we just cut, if I open the mouth of the bass, we cut right along the top, right here. That's where our cutter was going against that vertebrae. And you see we didn't put any holes in there. If you do, you can easily fix it, but there's no need to make extra work for yourself. Now we're going to cut directly against the show side skin to release this part of our triangle cut. So what we're going to be cutting is right in this area here. I cutter is going to be underneath the skin going back like this to release that brain cavity and that vertebrae. So open it up. In we go. Again, parallel to the skin. If we angle down, you're going to cut through to the show side. You hear that crunching? We're cutting right through those bones. I like to keep a hand under here while I'm doing this. I can feel if I'm going through at any point. At this point, we're in far enough, we're actually behind the cheekbone with where we're cutting. If you would go through now, you're just going to go into the cheekbone, which is much easier to hide and fix because you're not going to see it when the mount's completed. Just makes it a little bit harder if you cut into the cheekbone when you're trying to put your mache in the cheeks to recreate those later on. We're going to repeat that same procedure on the top part of the vertebrae and brain cavity right up here. And again, we're going to be cutting right where my finger is. There's a bone that runs right here. That's what we're cutting through. You can hear that snap. I'm right at the top now, right here. I'm going to go right to where my finger is. Just a little bit past where the scales stop. Just releasing this whole thing. Okay, the whole thing has been released, but we still need to make one more cut to get it out of there. I come again right on top of the throat latch, on the top of the esophagus, right along this vertebrae, right up into the eye cavity. And you can see where you might be able to see that in there, but right where my finger is, that's where the actual shears is. The end of that shears cutting blades are right there in the eye. You can see them when you're actually skinning this. I'm going to make one cut. You're going to hear a snap, and that just released the vertebrae from the top of the head. I take my cutter, grab onto the vertebrae, and I'm just going to twist it a little bit, and that'll release it. Now, as you can see looking in here, there's still a lot of meat we have to get rid of, and I'm going to do a lot of that with my cutter. Running parallel on top of the skin, I'm just going to cut back, and you're going to cut through a few small bones and some other sinews and tendons that are holding things together. A lot of fish skinning is all by ear. You're listening as you're going. If something doesn't sound right, it means you could have went through the actual skin and the scales. If you look right here, running back to the top of the brain cavity on the lateral dorsal line, you'll actually see where this bone is growing right into the skin. So you actually have to take your cutter and cut along that to get rid of it. That's what you want to see. So as I cut the meat out and release it, I like to pull it out and just get it out of my hair so I can actually see what I'm doing. You can see there. The more meat you can get out of here, the better. But you do not want to remove so much bone that the head starts becoming loose up here. And you'll know it when that happens. You'll lose the conformation of the head. We do not want to do that. You do not want to jeopardize the integrity of the head by taking too much bone out. Just some bone in the head is not going to affect the quality of the mount at all. We just want to get rid of the meat at this point. We're just working our cutter parallel to the skin so we don't go through, and we're just releasing some of these bones that are running along the top of the cheeks right here. It looks like we've removed about as much of that bone and meat as we can with our cutter. So we'll work on another area, and we'll finish that area off with our fleshing spoon. The last area we have to cut any bone away from before we actually start our fleshing is the tail or caudal. First thing I'm going to do is just split this skin open a little bit more. It's okay if it splits open. It's very easy for us to fix that, like you see right here. Now we need to remove the tail fin bone. I made a few cuts here earlier. I'm going to just make a few more here. I want to take my fish skinning knife and go underneath it. I want to go underneath it right to here. So I'm going between the skin and the tail fin bone to right to this point. If I go any further than that, I'm going to cut through here. We do not want to do that. We want to just go to where my thumb is, right there. Open it up, take the knife, work it underneath. It cuts through very easily. Work it forward, right to there. We do not want to go past this point. So now we have it all opened up and we didn't put any holes in it. Now we need to cut this excess meat out. If we don't cut the meat out, it's going to dry shriveled up. We do not want that. Again, I'm always parallel and down. I'm never like this. I get my hand behind it. I'm feeling to make sure I'm not going through anywhere. Okay, that side is complete. Now we'll do the other side. Just a little bit of trimming. You can sometimes turn it up this way. Just trim it a little bit, and that is complete. So we've got that area completely skinned out, and we did not put any holes in it. The next step is going to be flushing, but before we actually start the flushing process, we're going to take the bass over to our sink, and we're going to spray it off with cold water to get all of the bones and anything else on here completely cleaned off, including the show side. We're going to put new papers down. You want a very clean operation for this next step, and I'll explain why shortly. Now we're going to start flushing the bass. As you can see, we completely washed the bass off and got all of the bone fragments and any other meat fragments out of the inside cavity. I also sprayed off the show side so there's nothing underneath it. I just use cold water for that. It's very important that you have a very clean surface when you're flushing. If there's any imperfection between these scales in your paper or even underneath your paper, between the paper and the workbench, that will actually work the scales loose as you flush over it. It has to be completely clean, nothing underneath it. Keep that in mind as you're flushing as well. If little bits of bone get on the other side and you're flushing, you will lose scales if you flush over those areas. To start, I'm going to cover the entire inside of the fish with borax. This is powdered borax from Van Dyke's, which is a McKenzie company. This is the best borax to use for fish taxidermy, whether you're flushing or ultimately soaking the fish. What the borax does is that it helps to grab onto all this meat and makes the flushing process much easier. It also is easier for us to hold onto the skin as we're flushing. So I'm going to put a fairly liberal amount of borax in the skin. You can also put some of this on the show side if you want, but I've found over the years that just keeping that moist against the papers is better. I'm going to make sure I get plenty of this up onto this esophagus. We're going to be getting rid of all that meat as well. Okay, that's completely coated. Now we're going to start flushing. We use a number of different tools for flushing. One of those tools is an old-fashioned silver spoon. You can get these at thrift shops. These are excellent for flushing fish. They're very tough. Some of the newer spoons aren't really tough enough for this. So if you can find some of these, this is excellent. We're going to be using our fish skinning knife as well for cleanup work. We're going to be using a curved scissors if we need it, especially in the head cavity. And we're going to be using our shears again if we need it for a little bit of touch-up. So to get started, I always like to start right where the anal fin begins and the belly begins, right at the vent. And I'm starting on this side here, which is actually going to be folded up when we mount. This is a good place to start. In this particular area here, your strokes will have to be like this. On the show side and anywhere else you possibly can, you always want to make sure you flush up and down. So to say it, the easiest way is from the anal fin to the dorsal fin, or from the pelvic fins to the dorsal. If you go this direction, you'll dislodge scales. You really won't dislodge too many scales here. You might a few, but it's not that big of a deal because that's going to be covered up and on the wall side of the fish. So we'll go ahead and get started. I like to have an area that's completely clean when I get started. What I'm doing is I'm just scraping the meat away from the skin. Little strokes like that. You can hear it as it's going. Working right back to the tail. We have that area completely cleaned. I'm going to come through here and just clean up this edge. This is kind of our starting edge. That way we know from this point up, it's all clean. And we're going to be working our fleshings this way on the fish and eventually off the fish at the top. Okay, now we're at the belly area. This again is a very delicate area, so you want to use a lot of care. Make sure that there's nothing underneath it, so you don't have any bones or anything under here because you will pop those scales out. I hold my hand like this to hold the skin as I'm moving forward so the skin does not bunch up. If the skin bunches up, you're going to pop the scales no matter where it is on this fish. The skin cannot bunch up as you're fleshing. It always must be flat against the papers. Little strokes in this particular area. It's very delicate. Okay, now we're going to work up towards the pelvic fins. You can see I'm kind of doing the worst first here. By getting that belly area out of the way. Okay, now we just cleaned out around the pelvic fins. I can see there's just a little bit of meat there. I'm going to just take my cutter very carefully and just get rid of that. Okay, now I'm going to move up towards the throat latch. And the way I do that is I just start working the meat back towards the throat. I do not want to necessarily pull this way because I'll just break that throat latch out. So I'm just pushing it up. And I can actually start grabbing onto the meat here. Start pulling it up towards that throat latch very carefully. As I get towards the end of the latch, I just want to cut that meat. I do not want to just pull it. If I pull it, it's just going to break. Right like that. So now I'm going to work underneath the esophagus and clean out the rest of the throat latch area. Again, very delicate here. Just working on the esophagus, I'm scraping right along it, and there's a lot of meat that's held up underneath here. So I'm just pulling that meat out towards the body of the fish. You will have a slight area that opens up here, and it opens up here. That's fine. It means we got it very clean and all the way down to it. Working it right against that cleithrium bone that we left in. And you can see I'm scraping right on the bottom side of the esophagus. It's working that meat right off towards the body. I have enough meat removed from here. There's no more meat that needs to come out of the throat latch area. I can take my fish skinning knife and just scrape in here a little bit. And you can see you can get a little bit more meat out if you're real careful. It looks kind of red and bloody in here now, but after our soaking, you'll see how this is all just going to turn white. There really is no meat left in here. That particular area now is complete. So now we actually are going to start fleshing on the show side of the fish. I like to start right above the anal fin. I kind of bring my spoon in here, kind of cut in, and then start pulling towards the dorsal. Again, keeping that skin flat. See how my hands are here? You can kind of hear that everything breaking away as you're doing it. I'm working right up to the dorsal. And I take the tip of my spoon and I'm just pulling it right along that dorsal bone just to pull any meat out that's right in there. And you can do the same down here. You see we have a few tendons left here and sinews. We're going to go ahead and get rid of those right now. I'm going to use my shears. I'm just going to grab onto them, parallel to the skin. Just cut them right out. I'm going to continue from the peduncle area of the fish to the caudal fin. Again, same motion. From the anal towards the dorsal, holding that skin tight. Make sure it doesn't bunch up. Again, our objective here is we're trying to move the meat off in one direction. We know where we've started and it's clean, and we know where we have to work yet. That way we're not bouncing all around on the skin. I'm just working this off. This meat here can be a little difficult to get off. You have to scrape on it a little. It's okay if you go against the scales a little bit in this spot. You can see I'm actually just pulling that right off. By the tail region, I am going to go a little bit towards the tail. You can see there. Then I take my spoon and I get that corner of it right in by the tail here. And I'm actually just pulling any meat away from that fin. Now that we have that removed, you can see we have a few other tag ends we have to cut off. Just going to go right against the skin and just get rid of those. Right on the tail, there's also a couple of them we're just going to get rid of by going parallel to the skin. So that area is complete. This is a very delicate area on bass as far as losing scales. We didn't lose any here, as you can see, but you want to use extra care in that area. Okay, now we make sure nothing else is under our skin, because we did have the skin lifted up here for a second. And everything looks good, so we can continue flushing this area of the bass now. A little tag end I want to get rid of. Okay, this is our cleithrium bone. We're scratching right on top of it and to the side of it, and we're actually lifting it up a little bit with our spoon and getting right underneath it. We're just moving all this meat right towards those dorsal fins, the spiny and the soft. Okay, now we're going to take that pointed end of our spoon and we're going to go right along that dorsal, both the spiny and the soft dorsal. You can see how we're just moving that meat. On our form, when we put the rise at the soft dorsal and the slight rise at the spiny dorsal, that's what that meat did. We recreated where the meat we took out onto the form in those areas. The foam recreated it. And you can see this one has quite a bit of these tendons on it. We're just going to pull those off. Some of those can stay on. It doesn't hurt anything. You will not see it on a largemouth. If this was, let's say, a brook trout or a palomino trout, then you would see a lot more of these coming through. So you'd have to make sure that all of that's completely removed. Okay, now we're up into the head cavity. We're just going to take that pointed end of our spoon and we're going to go in there and pull any meat out. You're flushing around the top part of these cheekbones. You're just pulling in and around them. And I like to take my cutter, and I can actually put my fingers here. I can push that bone in so I can cut it easier. You can see it right there. It's going to thin that down a little. It's going to give our form some place to work. Same on this one. I'm putting my fingers underneath it to just pop it up. As long as I'm here, I'm going to get rid of this end of this cleithrium bone right here. By, again, putting my fingers underneath it, I can pop it up when I do that. We're going to get the extra meat that was underneath that cleithrium bone removed, and any extra meat that was still up in this cavity when we cut those bones out. We're going to go ahead and get that removed now. Basically what we're doing is we're just thinning down a few of these bones that are up here so there's room for our form to sit. If there's not, you'll have distortion, and you have a choice of either removing the bones a little bit more or carving those areas into your form. The best way to do that is to simply wait until you size it, and you can see if you need to do that. Now we need to clean the meat away from the top of the esophagus. There is a lot of meat here, as you can see. What I like to do is get a little bit of borax on it. I take my fish skinning knife and I just grab onto it and I start pulling it forward. You can also put a fleshing cone through the mouth, and that can give you more of a surface to work on, but I actually find just by having my thumb underneath it here, it's just as good. So you just want to get it down to that whitish looking esophagus. Grabbing onto it and just pulling it towards myself. When I get to this part here, where my knife is, I cut in a little bit, I start pulling down, like that. And then I go the other way up, that same way. See, I'm grabbing onto the meat and just pulling it, right like that, with my thumb on the other side of it. That's about all I'm going to be able to get at this point with my knife. So I'm going to take my shears again. I'm going to just go in at a little angle, start cutting out this meat. And after I do that, then there's some areas that'll free up a little bit, and I can just pull the rest right out. I get my thumb underneath here, I can push it up. You can see I do that a lot when I'm skinning. And that makes it so my cutter can actually find it and grab it and get rid of it. I take my cutter and just go across it one more time, like that. And that's about all the meat you're going to get out of there, and now we'll work on the top. The same procedure as the lower area, just grabbing on and kind of pulling it up. I'm coming through with my cutter and just removing as much meat as I can by digging in and then turning out. That meat kind of buries itself and folds in right underneath those gills. So we need to get rid of that. If you do leave a little bit here, it's okay, but I like to get out as much as I possibly can. It makes the fish dry much faster, and it reduces the risk of any bugs wanting to have anything to do with this mount. So we have everything cut out here, as you can see. There's a little bit of meat left, and you can actually take your curved scissors now and get in there and get a few more of those things removed. The more meat you take out now, the better. If there's a little bit left, some of it can stay in and you're okay. Some of it we'll actually get when we do a little bit of touch-up fleshing right before we mount the bass. If you don't remove it at this time, our soak we're going to be putting it in, our preservative soak, will not reach the critical esophagus area. So it's very important that it's removed now. So the only area we have left to flesh now on the bass is just this little area here, which is on the wall side of the dorsal. So when you get to this area, you can start to go back towards the tail with your fleshing. You don't have to necessarily do this. And it's very critical that you do that to get that meat away from the top part here. flushing it right off. Okay, we have a few other little things we need to clean up here, as you can see. It's going to nip those off. Take one more quick look at everything. Looking here at the inside of the esophagus. I'm just going to make one little cut here. There's a little bit of meat I need to get rid of right there. Otherwise, we look good. Now we can flip our fish over, take a look at the show side, see how we did. Let's get some of this borax off so we can see it. And everything looks good. We have no missing scales. We didn't come through at any of the fin junctures, and we did not break through at the tail. And everything is nice and tight up here with the head yet. We didn't lose any integrity. So this was a successful skinning and flushing job. Now we'll take this bass over to the sink. We will rinse it off and we'll put it in its preservative soak.